Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Let's talk about Blade Runner. And of course, I mean the original movie of 1982, I guess, and the recent sequel, Blade Runner 2049, which came out in 2017, I guess. Alright, so this video is based on an essay that I wrote about the original movie mostly, and about the idea of a sequel, because, well, I wrote it 3 years ago when the sequel was just announced. More than 3 years ago, I guess. Or, well, about so. Alright, so when it was announced, you see, I was just slightly irritated, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. So that was the motivation for writing this essay in the first place. And, well, first of all, my irritation was caused in general with this modern obsession with remakes and sequels and things like that. So I was afraid that this remake mania, so to speak, would ruin the original Blade Runner movie. But I was wrong, thankfully. But again, we'll talk about that. And again, of course, there would be spoilers in this video, but again, if you watched my previous videos, you know that spoilers actually don't spoil anything. They actually increase your pleasure from viewing something, so it's not a problem, so relax. Okay, so let's discuss the title firstly. Well, obviously, Blade Runner, it's not something very simple, you know, it's some fancy, interesting thing. And actually, the title comes from the book by Alan Nourse called Blade Runner, which was later adapted by William Burroughs for a screenplay. So he wrote a screenplay based on this book, which talked about illegal surgical instruments. So Blade Runner was someone who sold these illegal instruments, so sort of like a death dealer, you know, something like that. But Ridley Scott bought the rights for the title, but of course the Blade Runner movie is based, again, pretty loosely on another work of fiction, which is Philip K. Dick's book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Right, so only the title remained, basically. Which is kind of a fancy title, I think you'll agree, because it sounds very strange and sort of mysterious and sort of fancy at the same time, right? And you might say that, well, it's my interpretation, but I think it's kind of understandable that its modern reading of this title, of this term, is just something that has to do with danger. You know, you're like running on a blade, which is a super dangerous thing to do. So it makes sense because a job of a Blade Runner is very dangerous, right? Okay, so let's talk about the cultural aspects of this fictional universe. Well, first of all, some people say that Blade Runner is a dystopia, and I disagree here. Because, well, I'll give you a couple of examples why I think this is not the case. Well, for example, this Tyrell Corporation, and we're talking about the original movie. I'll talk about the 2049 sequel a little bit later, near the end of the video. So, in the original movie, Tyrell Corporation doesn't really govern everything. You know, it's just a commercial enterprise. With somewhat limited power, because, well, for example, law is against it in many respects. Like, replicants are banned on Earth, as you might remember, and well, in this one of the prequels for the 2049, one of those short films, there are 3 of those. Like Blackout, that's the first one, and I don't remember the titles of the other ones. You can find them on YouTube if you like. That they kind of fill the gap between the original movie and the sequel. So in 2022, as one of the prequels say, replicants were banned everywhere at all. I mean, after this blackout they've had, okay, due to replicants. And So yeah, my point was that law is above Tyrell Corporation and not vice versa. So yeah, and law actually works in this universe, in this setting at least, because, well, Deckard, the main protagonist of the first movie, is kind of incompetent, you might say, but he does his job and does pretty well. I mean, at least judging by the results, right? So that's one point, that they're not above the law. So the society is sort of regulated, at least somewhat. Then we see that there are many of what you might call self-made people. Again, this Tyrell guy, so he's like this nerdy genius, and he owns this huge corporation, so it's not a bad thing. He's not some evil villain, you know, in a regular sense of the word. He's not a dictator, not a tyrant. He's a pretty decent guy, actually, right? At least the way he's presented to us. And all the other nerdy guys also seem to be doing quite well, you know, all the people who work for Tyrell, this Chinese guy, this J.F. Sebastian, etc. So I think what it shows is that, and by the way, there is a certain analogy between Tyrell Corporation, where again everything is run by the nerds, and our modern developments. You know, when Google and Facebook and Apple have all this amazing power they have, and again they are run by the nerds. So I would guess it's somewhat of a prediction that Blade Runner movie has made or something, because when it came out, Apple Corporation wasn't I mean, Apple Incorporated or whatever, how it was called back then, it wasn't really as successful as it is right now. I mean, they haven't even put out this Macintosh Mac PC. I think it only came out in 1984, so nobody knew about them. So yeah, it really seems like a prediction, sort of. Okay, so from the fact that those capable people are on the top, we might say that it seems like the social mobility is quite high, right? So if you are competent, then you will rise up, and it's a good thing, right? It's not some despicable idiots on the top, but it's the people who actually do something useful. So it's another sign that it's not a dystopia at all. It actually, I would say, it represents a relatively healthy society. And again, why do I say relatively? Well, because it had a nuclear war, and it's probably understandable that it's not. You can't build a really good, like, functioning society after the nuclear war. So the way they're existing right now is much better than could have been, I would say. So yeah, it's certainly not a dystopia. That's my point. And of course there is like themes of alienation, of like personal tragedies, etc., etc. But it's okay, because well it's just a work of art. I mean, in any decent work of art you have to explore topics like that. So it's not well, at least not ultimately, not, damn, what's the right word? So it's not only the society's problem that it looks like that, but it's just in a decent work of fiction you would have that anyway. All right. And also what we are told there is that the off-world colonies, these other planets that we've colonized, are actually much better off than Earth, right? So this sort of apocalypse only happened on Earth, but there are other worlds that are prosperous. Now, of course, you might kind of look at it skeptically, especially in the original movie, where this stupid advertisement at the very beginning, like, a new life awaits you in the off-world colony. So it kind of sounds like it's a cheap trick just to get people to move there. But in this, in the sequel, we actually, like, people say that, yeah, it's actually better in the colonies, and all the people want to move there. And even in the original, when Pris asks Sebastian that is his health condition, was it the reason that he stayed? And he says that, yeah. So basically, all the capable people are actually moving away from Earth, right? But still, returning to my point, even on Earth, relatively capable and good people rise, basically. That's what I'm saying. Right, so it's not a dystopia in my opinion. It's a much better way to describe this movie is a neo-noir, you know, sort of like this detective story from like 40s or 50s. And actually, like, I've watched some of the development materials, and actors themselves say that, yeah, it was the idea to sort of reproduce a noir film in this sci-fi setting. And I believe that this is what Blade Runner is all about. It's this detective fiction, ultimately, or crime fiction, in the science fiction setting. So this is what the movie is all about. Both the original and the sequel, by the way. And well, you might notice all these little details that show you this is the case. Well, first of all, the plot is just a detective story, right? The guy looks for bad guys, basically, right? And he finds clues and he puts them together, etc. So, blah blah blah. And he wears this coat, right, like a detective, etc. Only the hat is missing, you know, to make it look like a 40s or 50s kind of movie. But then again, Gaff, this other Blade Runner who walks with a stick, Edward James Olmos's role, he has a hat, right? So everything is in its place in this sense. And Rachel is clothed in sort of retro style, like it's quite obvious, you know, and she's like, her whole outlook is super retro, vintage, you might say. So yeah, it's really a neo-noir kind of film. And there are also other postmodernistic, you might say, elements there, such as the cultural eclecticism, if that's even a word, eclecticism. But in this regard, you might say, well, it actually reinforces the idea that it's a dystopia, or at least it shows the society that's on the verge of collapse or already collapsing. Like you might think of, again, the same sort of cultural mixture that happens in late empires, you know, like the late Greek world after Alexander the Great, this Hellenistic era where you've had an incredible mixture of everything everywhere, or the late Roman Empire, which also showed the same thing, etc., etc. So, and you might see this really well in this scene, in this sequence with the chase or pursuit of Zora by Deckard. So you can see like all kinds of people there. Like there's these Hare Krishnas, there's punks, there's like all kinds of people right there, right? So it's this huge, how do you say it, boiling pot or melting pot or something, that kind of society. But okay, so a little bit of history of how it was made. So the first reaction of people actually, I mean, on these initial shows when the producers tried to understand what the hell have they produced. So the first reaction of the viewers were like quite negative, and it horrified producers. So they wanted to do something with it. So in the end, what happened was we've had like a lot of different versions of the film because, well, they've added a happy ending to it. They've added some like narrative, like funny narrative, especially at the beginning where this scene where Deckard reads a paper, there is a voiceover in one of the versions, which is completely ridiculous, and etc., etc. But anyway, I think the best versions are, well, the one I've watched multiple times, like 15 times maybe or something like that, is the final cut which, or I'm sorry, director's cut, which came out in 1992, I think, like 10 years after the initial release. But for this movie, for this video, before, like a couple of days ago, I watched the final cut, which is like even better than the director's cut, which was released in 2007, I think. So, and they are very similar, I would say. So yeah, you might watch any of those, either director's cut or final cut, but I wouldn't recommend any other versions. They're quite bad, again, for the reasons I've outlined before. And there are only minor differences between director's cut and final cut, so yeah, they're pretty much identical, more or less. So, okay, let's talk about the point of the movie. Well, you might say, well, it deals with existential issues, you know, again, as any sci-fi thing. But let's just discuss the plot, or at least how I see it. And it's not a new idea. I mean, it was discussed by many people over the decades. But still, I think it's the most sound way to perceive what we're shown in the movie. So since this is, as I've said, it's ultimately a detective story, well, let's try to gather some clues and then connect them together. All right, so the first clue we encounter is that the gaff, this guy with a stick and a hat, he leaves various figurines everywhere he goes, right? So that's the first clue. The second clue is that we learn from Tyrell that replicants, at least some of them, have implanted memories for emotional stability, etc. So those aren't their memories, but somebody else's, but it gives them a background so they don't behave as stupidly as they could otherwise. So that's the second clue, implanted memories. The third clue is that we see, we're being shown in the movie, Deckard's dream with a unicorn. And actually here, in the final cut, this scene is actually like 3 times longer than in the director's cut, and we also are shown, we see Deckard's face like 3 times in this sequence, so we understand that it's what he is seeing, right, and not somebody else. So okay, that's the third clue, Deckard's dream with a unicorn. The fourth clue that we encounter as we're watching is the 4-year lifespan of replicants of these new Nexus 6 models, right? And we actually see it right in front of our eyes when Roy Batty dies, this main villain, you might say. And the fifth clue is that the gaff, what do I call him? The gaff. He's just gaff. So he tells Deckard in this one of the last scenes when Batty dies that, well, there's this quote like, "It's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does?" And he was referring to Rachel, obviously. Okay, so those are the 5 clues. Again, gaff leaving figurines. Damn, what was the second one? Implanted memories, dream with a unicorn, 4-year lifespan, and this quote of Gaff that it's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does? All right. Then what we see at the very end is that Deckard returns to Rachel, well, to his own apartment actually, where she is resting, and they find accidentally on the floor in front of the apartment figurine of a unicorn, right? So what does it tell us? It kind of like all those clues kind of merge together, and everything just explodes with this amazing theme in B minor that we see during the ending titles, or how do you call it? So it means basically that Gaff knew that both Deckard and Rachel are replicants. He went there to kill Rachel, but he didn't. But he left there the figurine with a unicorn, which means that he saw Deckard's implanted memories / dreams, and he knows that he dreams of unicorn, right? So Deckard is a replicant too, that's what it means. And ultimately, so he decided to spare them, right? Both. He didn't kill her nor him. Right. So yeah, it's a really incredible story, I believe. Like it's almost like mythological plot, like in some Greek tragedy you might encounter, something like that. It's just incredible in my opinion. And so ultimately, in the end, Deckard realizes when he holds this unicorn and like smiles and nods. So, well, not really smiles, more like grins. But anyway, so he realizes that, well, first of all, he's a replicant. Now, he killed his own kin, other replicants. Then he's gonna die soon, right? See, this 4-year lifespan. But he's not alone. He's with a loved one, a woman he loves and who loves him back, and they're both gonna die soon, but they love each other and they escape together. So yeah, it's an amazing ending. It's like almost like the best finale ever. You know, it's like a supernova of plot lines. Or a cinematographic Zeus's thunderbolt, you know, something like that, like a flash. All right, so there's a lot of other evidence that Deckard is a replicant. Like, well, again, in the final cut, they made the unicorn scene like 3 times longer or about so. Then Deckard also has this strange glimmer in his eyes. As other replicants do, etc., etc. And there's a lot of other evidence of that sort. All right. Yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention is that the movie actually has a lot of plot holes. Like it was edited many times. You might notice that some scenes look strange and like some of the stuff was removed definitely. Some people say it's actually almost like 1 hour was removed. So yeah, it's not a big miracle, but yeah, like the plot doesn't seem very solid. I mean, outside of this general idea that I've just outlined. All right, and one other thing I've noticed when I was rewatching the original a couple of days ago, is that Rutger Hauer really looks like Jude Law. They have very similar, like, very similar facial expressions. All right, and I think in the final cut they've also changed the voiceover when Bryant presents those replicants to Deckard when we watch them on the screen. I think at least the description of Leon changed, but I might be wrong, but that was my impression at least. Alright, so we might examine character arcs that we have. Like, well, Deckard, he basically starts from like leave me alone kind of mentality, like he doesn't want anything. But he ends helping a replicant, so he completely changes his personality in some sense. And you might add to that he realizes that he's a replicant himself at the very end, right? So it's a complete, like, turning over the whole world to him. Now, Rachel starts as this sort of arrogant secretary, but then she learns that she's a replicant, and she tries to prove that she's not a replicant. Like, she shows the pictures to Deckard, etc., etc. But in the end, she comes to self-acceptance of sorts. So she says, well, okay, who cares if I'm a replicant or not? Like I love this guy, etc. And ultimately, what matters is my what I do, not what I am, basically, something like that. Right, and Roy Batty is probably the most important character in the whole movie. Arguably, he's actually the main character, and not Deckard. So he plays the role of this sort of angry god who came to Earth to basically have his revenge or something, to execute people, to remove the unfairness, etc. He's like the smartest and strongest and vengeful, and he like recites poetry, you know, and it's all super elevated or something to that effect, right? And what's interesting is that, well, there's a lot of symbolism in this movie, obviously, and when Batty encounters Tyrell, Tyrell is dressed in this like pajama or whatever, but it looks almost like a monk's robe, you know, like a priest. So it kind of reinforces all those religious motives, right? That sort of like it's the confession of Roy in front of Tyrell, ultimately his father, you know. So in front of God, and he actually calls him the god of biomechanics, you know, etc., etc. So there's a lot of symbolism of that sort there. Okay, and other thing about Batty is that in the final sequence he's playing with Deckard, right? So he constantly gives him chances to survive, to run away, etc. And ultimately, I would say it's some sort of mirroring happening here, because, well, what was the purpose of Batty, at least in the sense of coming to Earth? He wanted more life, right? He wanted to live longer, and that's what he lets Deckard do or have. He kind of tries to squeeze as much life as he can, so he never kills Deckard, and actually saves him in the end, to have more life in some sense, right? So he knows that at least he would be remembered by Deckard, right, or something to that effect. So by saving Deckard, he in some sense saved himself. And again, it's this religious symbolism of Christ and things like that. Like he died instead of Deckard, you know, in some sense. So he saved him, just as Christ did. Well, apparently, supposedly. Okay, so it makes sense, I believe. And he kind of comes to the realization that it's not through the killing or through this revenge that you become great or whatever, that you fulfill your purpose or destiny or whatever, but by saving people, you know. So it's a great character arc also. And it makes sense again. It's exactly what he wanted ultimately, and it's believable. All right, and well, again, all those questions about God and man, you know, people created replicants almost like God created people, again, supposedly, but it almost looks like replicants are better than people, so they're kind of like God. So it's a very interesting symbolism here. And replicants in the original movie actually look like sort of like angry children who return to kill their parents. And this quote by Rachel about her dream, where baby spiders killed their mother, it's sort of fitting here. You know, this idea of Jordan Peterson about how some kids don't feel like the kind of hierarchies that are present in the world are fair, so they need to be destroyed. So it's this narrative ultimately. But in the end, replicants represented by Batty, let's say, realize that destruction is not fruitful, right? And another interesting thing I wanted to talk about is that we have their 3 love lines in this movie, even though 2 of them are actually sort of put in aside. They're sort of not in the focus at the very least. And like, well, one obvious story is between Deckard and Rachel, and the other one is between Batty and Pris, and the third one is between Leon and Zora, right? Because, well, you can see on this picture that they lived together, etc., and you might see how Leon is astonished when he sees that Zora is dead, etc. So ultimately, and yeah, well, the funny thing is that all those 3 lines are between replicants, right? If you assume that Deckard is a replicant. So only replicants show love in this movie, which is kind of interesting. All right. So, yeah. Yeah, so what I'm saying is it shows the motivation they've had. Like, why did they wanted to live longer? Well, to stay with their loved ones longer. So this was the idea. So, and it's beautiful in this sense, right? And one other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a game also called Blade Runner from 1997, and it's just a brilliant game. Like it has, like its story is based on a very similar story to Deckard's, but it runs in parallel, so it's the same time frame even as the movie. So, but they just go parallel. So it talks about the game is about this also Blade Runner McCoy, who also learns that he's a replicant, etc., etc. So, and it's a very interesting game. It actually astonished me almost more than the movie in the first place. So, it's really interesting if you like that sort of thing. Even though the graphics, like the backgrounds are just perfect, but the way the characters are drawn is kind of horrible. But still, all right. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that, well, I'll save it for later, probably. So you can probably see why I was so irritated, or at least just irritated, by the idea of a sequel to this movie. Because, well, I thought initially that it would ruin the original, this idea that I've just outlined, that Deckard is a replicant and he's gonna die soon. Because, well, that was the core of the finale, at least for me. So it would destroy the beauty of the original if Deckard lived like 30 years more, or at least 30 years since the original. But it wasn't as bad as I thought, actually. I mean, Blade Runner 2049. So in general, it was actually a great movie, I would say. Like, again, today I've reviewed it, watched it again. The first time I watched it in the theaters in 2017, and today I've watched it at home. And back in the theater, back in 2017, I've had the impression that it's a really great movie. And right now, I have even stronger impression of that sort. So I wasn't dissatisfied at all, you might say. Even though, again, I would say it still ruins the original. But it's so good that I'm letting it slide, you know. I can forgive the authors that they did that. All right. So, well, let's talk a little bit about the sequel. So there, we are being told, at least in the prequels to the sequel, those 3 short movies, that Nexus 8, the next model, was promoted, which had actually natural lifespan. And you might say, well, maybe Deckard was one of those, and maybe even Rachel was one of those, right? So yeah, that's a perfect way to sort of combine the 2 stories, right? Even though it wouldn't be, again, as dramatic, but maybe Deckard thought that they both would die in 4 years, so, or at least or even less than 4 years. But anyway, so and they've had this blackout event when a nuclear rocket was exploded above Los Angeles, and it erased all the data and things like that. So and replicants were prohibited after that. Well, just like in the first place, they couldn't be produced anymore. But this other, so Tyrell Corporation got bankrupt, but later the Wallace Corporation, led by this Wallace guy, acquired rights to produce replicants, but it happened like more than 10 years later, right? So, yeah, well, one thing about this Wallace guy, Jared Leto, or Leto, how do you pronounce it? I would actually say that his acting is quite questionable. And it's probably the worst thing about this movie is the acting of the villain, and in general, the the character of the villain, because, well, he just looks ridiculous in so many ways. And I actually thought maybe he's a replicant himself, because again, this recurring theme with eyes, and he has those strange eyes. Well, he's basically blind, but blah blah blah. Anyway, so damn, what I wanted to say. So he just tries so hard to look like a villain, right? But he doesn't really act as a villain. I mean, he kills a couple of replicants here and there, but that's about as evil as he gets, right? So it just looks ridiculous in this regard, in my opinion, at least. Well, this woman that he has, this love, she's a much better villain in this sense, because, well, yeah, that's a decent villain. And again, it makes sense because she's a replicant, and she's what Wallace calls an angel, so she's sort of like a defective replicant, because, well, you can see that she's emotional, whereas other replicants shouldn't be. So she's an error in some sense, but she's a very cool character, I would say. All right, so yeah, what did I want to talk about also? Well, just some other random things, like this madam, this police boss. She seems to be in love with the main character, and this love character seems to be in love with Deckard, or at least she seems to be amazed with him in the sense that, well, he produced a child with a replicant, and maybe she hopes to have a child with him or something like that. Like if you watch this scene where she brings him to somewhere, I don't know, before they got shot down by Kay, you can easily notice that she's at least not, well, she cares about him at least, right? All right. So in general, the movie is great, and it's great in terms of visuals. Like, visuals are really amazing, both the light and the colors and the contrast, and it's just brilliant, and the camera work is amazing, etc. And I don't remember if I mentioned that, but returning to the original, so one other point why this is a noir film, neo-noir, is that it constantly rains there, and the contrast is very strong. So, you know, they say that in noir films you always have those like vertical lines or like diagonal lines. They prevail. So rain is like ultimate bunch of vertical lines. And another thing is this high contrast, because you have well, I mean, I'm talking about the original movie, although to some degree it's also true for the sequel. But in the original movie, the contrast is just so high that the movie almost looks black and white in some respect, you know. So it's also, you know, reinforces the idea that it's a noir film. All right, and what I was thinking about with regards to the visuals and this very slow dramatic component that we have in the sequel, especially because like it's almost like super slow motion drama, you know, but at the same time we have a lot of landscapes and visuals, and they're just brilliant and amazing. So I was having a thought with regards to this, that maybe we're moving to some post-drama movies. I don't know, it sounds stupid, but well, that was the idea I've had, because well, again, you might remove like half of the scenes from Blade Runner 2049 and drama wouldn't suffer, right? But what would suffer is like the mood, the context would be sort of cut a little bit, right? But you might say that in Blade Runner 2049, it's those landscapes, the scenery, the visuals, they actually act as separate characters themselves, right? So it's a completely different level of dramatization in some sense, right? It's these modern opportunities or possibilities of building those incredible sceneries. They allow us to tell the story in a different way, not just through characters, but through the environment also, right? So that's what I was thinking about. And to certain degree, a very similar thing you might see in Joker movie, this recent one, with Joaquin Phoenix, and to some degree, again, even in The Last Jedi, which I talked about in my Star Wars video. So maybe actually visuals became too good, you know, our technologies developed so good that yeah, well, we just cannot do anything else other than introducing the scenery itself as a separate actor, well, effectively, right? So it definitely seems like a next step in the development of cinema, I would say, at least. All right, and in my video about music of memes, I've already discussed this, how our book civilization, roughly speaking, is being supplemented or substituted by video civilization, you know, because instead of reading these long novels, these what is called roman in Russian, I'm not sure what's the proper title in English, but those very long novels, works of fiction at least, now we watch very long works of fiction and video, you know, TV series and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely a thing. So on one end we have books where all the visuals we've had were only present in our imagination, right? We only read description of a visual, so it cannot really play a role in this sense, right? It's not jumping on us from the pages. We kind of contain it in our imagination. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have modern cinema with incredible visuals, which kind of hit us, you know. So they might act as separate characters. I mean, as characters of their own. But okay, I think I've already talked about this enough. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention is that the arc of main character K in the sequel is actually pretty great. Like, again, he starts with being like content in some sense, you know, he just follows orders and everything is fine. Then he starts to suspect that he's this special child, and this suspicion actually grows until it's finally broken when he learns that he's not this special boy, that it's actually a special girl in the first place, and so it's definitely not him when this leader of replicants tells him that. So he collapses sort of in this absolute nothingness. So it was quite a crush for him, but he ends up being at peace with himself again. So he recovers from this whole, by realizing again this recurring theme that it's what you do what makes you human in some sense. It's not like, again, and this quote by this replicant leader is also repeated there, that yeah, it's like saving others, basically dying for the cause, etc., is the most humane or human thing to do. So that's what he does. He saves Deckard, and he brings him to his daughter, and again, in some sense it just rhymes with what Batty did in the original movie, right? So Batty, in some sense, also became human, or even more human than human, you know. Okay, so yeah, and he also learns along the way that this Joy character is just a, well, decoy, basically. Like she tells him what he wants to hear, right? It's not because he's special, but it's because she's programmed in that way as to fulfill your dreams and like tell you how cool you are, etc., etc. So yeah, so he realizes that when he sees this huge hologram on some bridge or whatever it is. All right, so I guess in the end you might say that it's a great movie, the sequel, I mean, and it doesn't really matter if Deckard is a replicant or not. So it sort of removes my initial counter argument to this movie, so to speak, because ultimately what matters, you might say, even the question itself, is Deckard a replicant? The question itself is much more important than the answer, right? And even a larger question you might ask, what makes us human? And again, in some sense, the movies show that it's what you do is what makes you human, not what you are initially, sort of, right? And well, there's one guy on YouTube, you might find his channel, Lore Runner. It's one word, Lore Runner. So he says that one of the main topics of the original movie is that basically, regardless of whether Deckard is a replicant or not, the topic of the movie is that the value of life is very low. Like, it's basically zero in this world, at least, on Earth, at least. And the movie shows us how both people and replicants live quite horrible lives. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a robot or a human being, or rather, replicants aren't quite robots. They're like bio-robots, you might say. Okay, so they both live horribly and they die horribly. So, yeah. So in this sense, my irritation isn't that strong. And you might invent some ways of, again, reconciling. You might say, again, Deckard is Nexus 8, and Rachel is also Nexus 8. Well, she died in childbirth, right? So we don't know how long she would live. So basically, Gaff was wrong by assuming that they would die soon, etc., etc. And the movie also explores themes of loneliness, futility, and things like that. Like, but okay, like, I've rambled enough about this. One other thing I wanted to mention is that, well, it's quite obvious that there's a possibility of a sequel, again, to Blade Runner 2049, because we are explicitly told in the movie that there's going to be a replicant revolution, etc., etc., some sort of rebellion. Then I've thought, and I think it might be an interesting avenue for screenwriters to develop, is that we've never been shown other parts of the world. We've only seen Los Angeles in both movies. Well, maybe it was Las Vegas in the sequel, right? These casinos. I'm not quite sure. Was either other parts of California or was Las Vegas maybe? But anyway, it's still a very small segment of the world. So you might explore some other places and maybe, like, potentially you have so many spin-offs that you might do, you know, something that happens in other corners of the world, etc. And even more interestingly, we're not shown this off-world colonies, right? So it would be interesting to see how life there happens, what happens there. One possibility for a sequel would be sort of like a spilling out of Earth's problems to the off-world colonies, which are supposedly like prosperous and happy. So it would be interesting to look at something like that. Like, let's say, replicants from Earth going into the off-world colonies, or people from Earth going there, or something like that. And I've had the idea that maybe this whole off-world thing is actually a lie. Like, imagine what would happen in this case. That would be very interesting. That would certainly have another argument in favor of Blade Runner as dystopia, but it would be a very strong plot move, I think. All right. So, or you might think about the reversing of the situation. Let's say this rebellion of replicants won, and they might start killing people, right? So in the end, you might have the reverse situation where there are only few humans remaining, and the majority are replicants, and the humans are hunted down, or at least despised, etc., etc. So it would be a good opportunity for another sequel, basically. That's what I'm saying. All right, so to sum this up, I believe those are the great movies, like really both of them. And Like I'm really happy that we have that sort of work available for us, that sort of work of fiction. And the game is also great. Like I certainly recommend you to look it up, to play it even maybe, or maybe watch like walkthroughs on YouTube or something, or cutscenes maybe. It's really great. Like it's super atmospheric. It has like 16 different endings, I've heard, or maybe 12 at least. I think I've only unlocked like 4 or 5. But anyway, all right. So we'll see. Probably there's gonna be some more sequels to this universe, and I really hope they would be as good as the original and this sequel that we have today. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.